The helicopter blades thundered overhead as paramedic Jake Morrison froze mid-reach toward the unconscious elderly woman, his gloved hand trembling inches from her pulse point. Below, in the Amazon canopy, a massive spectacled bear refused to move from the woman's side, protective amber eyes locked on the descending aircraft. This wasn't a typical rescue. Wild bears don't guard strangers. Sarah Beth Williams collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, while Bobby McKenzie's weathered hands shook so violently his phone nearly slipped from his grip. "Sweet Jesus," the old veteran whispered, his voice cracking like dry timber. "Y'all recording this?" Margaret O'Sullivan's face, peaceful despite her critical condition, bore the same serene expression she'd worn 40 years ago when nursing wounded soldiers, but now a 200-pound wild bear served as her guardian angel. "Get that tranquilizer ready," the pilot shouted over the rotor wash, fighting against his own disbelief. What bond could possibly exist between a dying grandmother and a mother bear? And why was the animal risking everything to protect a human she should fear? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Margaret O'Sullivan had always believed that life's most meaningful chapters were written in its final pages. At 68, with silver hair that caught morning light like spun moonbeams and hands that bore the gentle scars of 4 decades nursing both humans and wounded animals, she represented everything America too often discarded: wisdom earned through suffering, compassion deepened by loss, and a stubborn refusal to fade quietly into irrelevance. The $2,997 Amazon adventure represented more than a bucket list indulgence. It was Margaret's desperate attempt to prove she still mattered. 6 months earlier, her children Michael and Patricia had cornered her in the sterile conference room of Sunset Manor, armed with brochures featuring smiling seniors playing checkers and pamphlets promising dignified care for your loved one's golden years. The conversation had lasted exactly 14 minutes. She'd timed it on her late husband Patrick's pocket watch before they'd made their decision without consulting her. "Mom, you forgot to take your medication 3 times last week," Patricia had said, her voice carrying the patronizing tone reserved for children and the elderly. "The early-stage Alzheimer's is progressing. We can't risk you living alone anymore." But Margaret harbored a secret that would shatter her children's carefully constructed narrative. Those forgotten medications? She'd been hiding them, testing herself, terrified that the diagnosis might be correct. The truth was both better and worse than they imagined. Her mind remained sharp as ever, but her bank account told a different story. Patrick's cancer treatment had devoured their savings like a hungry beast, leaving behind $127,000 in medical debt that followed her like a shadow. Bobby McKenzie represented a different kind of American tragedy. At 72, the Vietnam veteran carried 2 Purple Hearts and enough shrapnel in his left leg to set off airport metal detectors, yet he lived in a rusted trailer behind Murphy's auto shop, surviving on black coffee and stubborn pride. His refusal to accept VA benefits, no handouts for this old soldier, masked a deeper fear that accepting help would somehow dishonor the boys who never made it home. Sarah Beth Williams embodied the crushing weight of the modern American dream deferred. At 45, she juggled 3 part-time jobs while raising 17-year-old Emma alone, their modest house in suburban Minneapolis teetering on the edge of foreclosure. The divorce settlement had been generous on paper but worthless in practice. Her ex-husband's gambling debts had evaporated their equity faster than morning mist. This Amazon guide position, paying $5,000 for 8 days of work, represented her final chance to save their home before Emma started college. The 4th member of their unlikely quartet, Dr. James Rodriguez, carried his own burden of professional desperation. At 38, the Stanford-educated wildlife researcher faced a brutal academic reality. publish breakthrough research, or lose tenure forever. His study of spectacled bears had yielded promising data, but not the revolutionary discovery that would secure his future. What he needed was something unprecedented, something that would change how the world viewed animal intelligence forever. None of them realized they were about to find exactly that. The Amazon rainforest had been whispering warnings all morning, birds falling silent, insects retreating, even the humid air itself seeming to hold its breath. Margaret noticed first, her nursing instincts attuned to subtle changes that others missed. "Something's not right," she murmured to Bobby as they followed the narrow trail deeper into the green cathedral of ancient trees. At 2:30 p.m. on their first day, the forest exploded with the most horrifying sound any of them had ever heard. A keening wail that seemed to tear the very air apart, part scream, part roar, part desperate plea for help. The sound froze them all mid-step, sending ice through their veins despite the oppressive jungle heat. "What in God's name was that?" Bobby whispered, his hand instinctively reaching for the flare gun on his belt, muscle memory from decades past when unknown sounds meant mortal danger. The answer revealed itself 50 yards ahead in a small clearing where nature had orchestrated its own version of hell. A massive green anaconda, easily 25 feet long and thick as a telephone pole, had wrapped itself around an adult, spectacled bear with the methodical precision of a living torture device. The bear's ribs creaked audibly under the crushing pressure, each breath a monumental struggle against the snake's relentless constriction. But what broke Margaret's heart weren't the bear's desperate sounds. It was the two small cubs, no more than 8 months old, pacing frantically around their dying mother, their plaintive cries echoing through the trees like lost children calling for help that would never come. "Jesus Christ," Jimmy breathed, his camera already recording, scientific training warring with human horror. "That anaconda weighs at least 200 pounds. The bear doesn't have a chance." Sarah covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she watched the cubs' futile attempts to help their mother. One small cub bit at the snake's tail, its baby teeth utterly useless against the anaconda's armored scales. The other pressed against its mother's face as if trying to share its own breath. Margaret stepped forward, her nurse's training overriding every rational thought. "We can't just watch this happen." "Ma'am, that's a wild anaconda," Jimmy protested. "If we interfere, we could all end up—" "That's a mother fighting for her babies," Margaret interrupted, her voice carrying an authority none of them had heard before. "I've seen enough mothers die to know when one's worth saving." Bobby studied Margaret's face, recognizing something he'd seen in the best officers he'd served under. The kind of quiet determination that moved mountains and won impossible battles. "What do you need, ma'am?" Margaret's mind raced through decades of emergency protocols, adapting trauma surgery principles to jungle rescue. "Jimmy, we need noise, loud, chaotic noise to disorient the snake. Bobby, find the longest, strongest branch you can. Sarah, gather anything spicy, those red berries, those plants with the waxy leaves. We're going to make this snake very uncomfortable." For the next 23 minutes they waged war against nature itself. Jimmy banged rocks together and shouted at the top of his lungs while Bobby wielded a 6-foot branch like a medieval staff, prodding and jabbing at the anaconda's head. Sarah crushed spicy plants and berries, creating a pungent mixture that made their own eyes water. But it was Margaret who made the difference. While the others created chaos from a safe distance, she crawled within striking range of the anaconda's massive head, speaking in the soft, soothing tone she'd used with frightened patients for 40 years. "Easy, baby. Easy now," she whispered to the struggling bear, her hands gentle as she worked to loosen the coils around the animal's chest. "We've got you, Mama. Your babies need you to fight just a little longer." The bear's amber eyes, glazed with pain and exhaustion, suddenly focused on Margaret's face with startling intensity. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding that transcended species, a recognition of shared motherhood, and the fierce love that drives all mothers to impossible lengths. The anaconda, overwhelmed by the sustained assault on its senses, finally released its grip and slithered away into the undergrowth with wounded dignity. The bear collapsed, gasping, her ribs visibly deformed from the crushing pressure. Margaret's nursing instincts took over completely. She checked the bear's pupils for signs of brain trauma, felt along her ribs for breaks, and used her water bottle to drip sugar water into the animal's mouth. Shock, she diagnosed quietly. Possible internal bleeding, definitely some broken ribs, but she's strong. The cubs rushed to their mother, nuzzling against her face and making soft, chirping sounds of relief. But what happened next would haunt all of them forever. The mother bear, still weak and struggling to breathe, lifted her massive head and gently licked Margaret's hand. Once, twice, 3 times, before allowing her cubs to approach the elderly woman without fear. "I'll be damned," Bobby whispered, his phone capturing every second. That bear just said thank you. The Amazon had seemed like paradise on day 2, a green cathedral of infinite beauty where exotic birds painted the canopy with brilliant colors and the air itself hummed with life. Margaret had named the bear Luna after watching her silver-tipped fur catch moonlight the previous evening, and the cubs had taken to following Margaret like furry shadows, accepting fruit from her weathered hands with remarkable trust. 40 years of nursing, and I've never seen anything like this, Margaret told Sarah as they watched Luna demonstrate which berries were safe for her cubs to eat. It's like she's trying to teach us something, but paradise has a way of revealing its teeth when humans grow too comfortable. On day 3, the weather shifted with the brutal suddenness that makes the Amazon legendary among survivors and fatal for the unprepared. What began as scattered clouds became a wall of churning black that swallowed the sky, bringing winds that howled through the canopy like vengeful spirits. The storm struck with apocalyptic fury. 40-mile-per-hour winds turned trees into battering rams, sending branches the size of telephone poles crashing down around them. Jimmy's satellite phone, their lifeline to civilization, exploded in a shower of sparks when lightning struck a nearby cecropia tree. The GPS device that Bobby had trusted to guide them home short-circuited in the torrential rain, its screen fading to black like a dying eye. "The map!" Sarah screamed over the wind, watching helplessly as their laminated trail guide dissolved into pulp under the relentless downpour. "Everything's ruined." They huddled under a makeshift shelter of palm fronds, but even their basic supplies suffered devastating damage. Food containers cracked open, spilling precious protein bars into the muddy water that now flowed like a river beneath their feet. Margaret's medication bottles filled with rainwater, turning her Alzheimer's prescription into useless slush. Day 4 dawned with deceptive calm, but their situation had transformed from adventure into survival nightmare. Without GPS or map, they faced the Amazon's most terrible truth. In 2.7 million square miles of identical green maze, being lost meant being dead. "I've been in jungles before," Bobby admitted, his military confidence shaken for the first time. "But never without equipment, never without backup." His hands, steady enough to field strip a rifle in pitch darkness, trembled as he tried to construct a signal fire with wet kindling. Margaret's condition became their first crisis. The destroyed medication meant her early-stage Alzheimer's symptoms returned with vengeance. She began calling Sarah Nurse Thompson, a colleague from 30 years past, and asked Bobby repeatedly when their shift ended. Most heartbreaking of all, she sometimes forgot where they were entirely, wandering toward dangerous areas until one of them gently guided her back. Mom always said the mind goes first, Margaret confided to Sarah during a lucid moment, tears mixing with rainwater on her cheeks. I just hoped I'd have more time before it took me. The physical toll mounted relentlessly. Sarah's foot, cut on a broken bottle during the storm, developed angry red streaks that screamed infection. The wound oozed yellow pus despite their attempts at cleaning, and she developed a fever that left her shivering even in the oppressive heat. Bobby's old war wounds, aggravated by constant dampness, began showing signs of jungle rot. The shrapnel in his leg, usually just a dull ache, became a constant agony that made walking torture. Worse, his hands developed a tremor that had nothing to do with age. Stress and untreated trauma were finally claiming their due. By day 5, even Jimmy's academic optimism cracked. "I've been studying this region for 8 years," he admitted, staring at their useless equipment. "Without the GPS coordinates, I honestly don't know which direction leads home." Food supplies dwindled to nothing. Their last protein bar, soggy and barely edible, was divided into 4 pathetic portions that only emphasized their desperate situation. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, but it was the thirst that truly terrified them. Finding clean water in a region famous for parasites and waterborne diseases seemed impossible. "We're going to die out here," Sarah whispered on their 5th night, infection fever making her delirious. "Emma will never know what happened to her mother." Dawn on day 6 arrived without fanfare, just another gray smudge of light filtering through the endless canopy above their makeshift shelter. Margaret lay unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular, while Bobby kept vigil with the dedication of a soldier guarding fallen comrades. Sarah's fever had broken during the night, but she remained weak and disoriented, her infected foot now swollen to twice its normal size. "She's dying," Jimmy whispered, checking Margaret's pulse with fingers that shook from exhaustion and hunger. "Without proper medical care, she won't last another day." Bobby's weathered face contorted with grief and rage. 40 years she spent saving other people's lives, and we can't even keep her comfortable in her final hours. His voice cracked on the last words, decades of suppressed emotion finally breaking through the stoic facade he'd maintained since Vietnam. It was 5:47 a.m. when the rustling began, soft at first, like wind through leaves, then more deliberate, more purposeful. Sarah struggled to sit up, fear overriding weakness as she peered into the green shadows surrounding their camp. In the Amazon, unexpected sounds usually meant predators, and they had no strength left to run. But what emerged from the undergrowth defied every law of nature they understood. Luna stepped into their clearing, her massive frame moving with careful deliberation, something large and brown clutched gently in her powerful jaws. Behind her, the 2 cubs followed in single file, each carrying smaller objects in their mouths, like offerings from some forest deity. "Jesus Christ," Bobby breathed, his phone instinctively rising to capture what might be his last recording. "Are those Brazil nuts?" Luna approached Margaret's still form and carefully deposited a collection of fresh Brazil nuts beside her head, their shells still damp with morning dew. The cubs followed their mother's example, dropping wild acai berries and small, unfamiliar fruits around the unconscious woman like a natural pharmacy, but Luna wasn't finished. She disappeared into the forest again, returning minutes later with something that made Jimmy's scientific mind reel in disbelief. Clutched delicately in her teeth were several leaves from a copaiba tree, a plant indigenous peoples had used for centuries as a natural anti-inflammatory and pain reliever. "That's impossible," Jimmy stammered. "She can't possibly know." Luna approached Margaret's unconscious form and began to examine her with the methodical attention of a trained nurse. She sniffed Margaret's infected scratches, then carefully placed specific leaves beside each wound. When she reached Margaret's swollen ankle, twisted during their panicked flight from the storm, Luna's behavior became even more extraordinary. The massive bear disappeared into the forest once more, this time returning with something that left them all speechless, a piece of wild honeycomb still dripping with golden sweetness. Luna broke off small pieces and gently nudged them toward Margaret's lips, as if understanding that the sugar might provide essential energy. "She's doctoring her," Bobby whispered in amazement. "That bear is actually treating Margaret like a patient." Sarah struggled to her feet, her infected foot screaming in protest. "How is this possible? Bears don't have medical training. They don't understand human medicine." But Luna's behavior suggested otherwise. She moved around Margaret's body with systematic precision, examining each injury, each sign of distress. When she reached Sarah's infected foot, Luna's reaction was immediate and startling. She sniffed the wound, then trotted back into the forest with obvious urgency. Minutes later, she returned with leaves none of them recognized, broad, waxy specimens that she placed directly beside Sarah's foot. Jimmy photographed everything, his scientific training warring with his inability to comprehend what he was witnessing. "The indigenous people of this region have used plants for medicine for thousands of years," Jimmy said slowly, thinking aloud. But how could Luna possibly know which plants work for human ailments? The answer came in fragments, pieces of a puzzle that would take days to fully understand. Luna's behavior around Margaret wasn't just protective, it was familiar. The way she checked Margaret's pulse by pressing her nose against her wrist, the gentle manner in which she adjusted Margaret's position to ease breathing, the careful selection of medicinal plants. These weren't random acts of animal kindness. This was learned behavior. Bobby noticed it first, the way Luna's eyes never left Margaret's face when she was treating her. "I've seen that look before," he said quietly. "In field hospitals, when medics worked on their own wounded. That bear knows this woman." Margaret stirred as Luna's rough tongue gently cleaned a cut on her forehead, the same methodical motion she'd used on her own cubs. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then suddenly sharp with recognition. "Patches," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is that you, baby girl?" Luna's entire body went rigid at the name, her amber eyes locking onto Margaret's face with an intensity that made the air itself seem to vibrate. She made a low rumbling sound, not aggressive but communicative, and gently nuzzled Margaret's outstretched hand. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed. "You know each other." Margaret's memory, crystal clear in this moment of reunion, began to unlock secrets that would transform everything they thought they knew about animal intelligence and emotion. 3 years earlier, when she was still working part-time at the Minneapolis Zoo's veterinary clinic, a severely injured, spectacled bear cub had arrived from an illegal exotic animal dealer. The cub had been beaten, malnourished, and close to death. "I called her Patches because of the white marking on her chest," Margaret said softly, her hand stroking Luna's massive head. "She was so small, so scared. I spent 6 months nursing her back to health before the wildlife rehabilitation program could place her in a sanctuary." Luna's behavior suddenly made perfect sense. She had recognized Margaret's scent, her voice, her gentle touch, and remembered the human who had saved her life as a helpless cub. But more than that, Luna had learned by watching Margaret work, absorbing medical knowledge through months of observation and care. "She watched you treat animals," Jimmy said in wonder. "She learned your techniques, your plant knowledge, everything." The cubs, sensing their mother's emotional state, pressed close to both Luna and Margaret, creating a family circle that included all 4 humans. In that moment, the barriers between species seemed to dissolve completely. Over the following hours, Luna demonstrated knowledge that defied scientific understanding. She led them to a hidden spring with clean, fresh water. She showed them which insects to avoid and which fruits provided the most nutrition. Most remarkably, She seemed to understand their need for direction, beginning to mark trees with her claws in patterns that suggested a route. "She's planning something," Bobby observed, watching Luna's systematic tree marking. "Military planning. She's got a route worked out." Margaret, revitalized by Luna's medicinal treatments and the emotional boost of reunion, began to understand Luna's intentions. "She's going to lead us out, isn't she? She's going to take us home." Luna's cubs had grown since Margaret's time with their mother, but they still remembered the human who had helped raise them during those crucial early months. They brought Margaret insects they'd caught, shared their foraging discoveries, and followed her movements with the devotion of children with their grandmother. As evening approached on day 6, their situation had transformed from hopeless to miraculous. Luna had not only found them in their moment of greatest need, she had brought medical knowledge, food, water, and most importantly, hope. The bear who had once been a helpless patient was now the doctor, returning the gift of life to the human who had first given it to her. But their celebration was premature. Unknown to them, other eyes had been watching from the shadows, human eyes filled with greed and calculating the monetary value of a spectacled bear family worth more than most people's homes. Marcus Blackwood and his hunting team had been tracking Luna's family for weeks, and the presence of wealthy American tourists only complicated their lucrative but illegal operation. What happened next would test the bonds between all of them, human and bear alike, in ways none of them could imagine. The morning of day 8 arrived with the deceptive tranquility of a funeral parlor, beautiful and ominous in equal measure. Luna had spent the previous day leading them through increasingly familiar terrain, her confidence growing with each marked tree and recognized landmark. Margaret's strength had returned dramatically under Luna's care, the bear's medicinal plants working better than any prescription drug she'd ever taken. "We're close," Sarah whispered, pointing to tire tracks barely visible in the muddy ground. "Those are fresh, maybe 12 hours old." Bobby adjusted his grip on the makeshift walking stick Luna had found for him, his military instincts prickling with unease. Something's not right. Too quiet. Even the birds have stopped singing. They emerged from the dense forest into a small clearing where their nightmare began. 5 men in military-style camouflage waited with the patient stillness of professional hunters, their tranquilizer rifles gleaming in the dappled sunlight. At their center stood a man whose weathered face bore the hard lines of someone who had seen too much death and caused more than his share. Marcus Blackwood, 52 years old and carrying the weight of unforgivable loss, studied the unusual group with calculating eyes. His graying beard couldn't hide the cruel twist of his mouth, and his hands, steady enough to drop a charging elephant at 100 yards, rested casually on a rifle worth more than most people's cars. "Well, well," Marcus drawled, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. 4 lost tourists and the most valuable, spectacled bear family in South America. My lucky day. Luna sensed the danger immediately, her massive body tensing as she positioned herself between the armed men and her human family. The cubs, responding to their mother's alarm, pressed against Margaret's legs, their small bodies trembling with instinctual fear. "Those bears saved our lives," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the rifles pointed in their direction. "We won't let you hurt them." Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Lady, you don't understand the economics here. That adult female is worth $75,000 to the right buyer. The cubs will bring $30,000 each. That's 135,000 reasons why your opinion doesn't matter." Bobby's military training kicked in, his eyes automatically cataloging weapons, escape routes, and tactical disadvantages. 5 armed men, tranquilizer guns, professional equipment. "We're outgunned and outmanned, but not outfought," he muttered to Jimmy. "You can't just steal them," Sarah protested, her mother's fury overriding her fear. "These are endangered animals." "There are laws," Laws? Marcus's laugh turned bitter. Laws are for people who have something left to lose. I lost everything that mattered 8 years ago, and I learned that noble ideals don't pay medical bills or bring back dead children. The revelation hung in the air like poison gas. Marcus Blackwood hadn't always been a poacher. The expensive equipment, the military precision of his team, the way he spoke about wildlife suggested a more complex history. Margaret, her nursing instincts attuned to human pain as much as physical wounds, recognized the grief in Marcus's eyes. "You lost a child," she said gently. "That's what this is really about, isn't it?" Marcus's face contorted with rage and agony. "My daughter Emily, 8 years old. We were camping in Yellowstone, supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. A black bear got into our campsite while I was getting water. By the time I got back..." His voice broke, years of suppressed grief finally cracking his armor. Emily loved animals more than anything else in the world, had stuffed bears in every corner of her room, used to tell me she wanted to be a veterinarian so she could help all the sick animals. Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his rifle never wavering. "I used to think like you people, used to believe in conservation and coexistence and all that Disney bullshit." Jimmy stepped forward, his academic instincts overriding his fear. "So you decided to declare war on the very animals your daughter loved?" "I decided to face reality," Marcus snarled. "Bears are killers. Pretty, majestic killers that bleeding hearts romanticize until they lose someone they love. At least in captivity, they can't destroy any more families." Luna's behavior during this confrontation was remarkable in its restraint. Despite her obvious recognition of mortal danger, she made no aggressive moves. Instead, she seemed to be assessing the situation with almost human intelligence, her amber eyes moving from weapon to weapon, calculating odds with the precision of a military strategist. The standoff stretched for agonizing minutes, tension building like steam in a pressure cooker. Marcus's men grew restless, fingers moving closer to triggers, while Luna's cubs whimpered softly behind their mother's protective bulk. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus finally announced. "You four are going to walk away and pretend this never happened. The bears come with us. Clean, simple, nobody gets hurt." "Like hell," Bobby growled, his hand moving toward the flare gun on his belt. "Old man, I've killed more things than you've had hot meals. Don't test me." But it was Margaret who changed everything. Drawing on 4 decades of dealing with frightened, angry patients, she stepped directly into the line of fire, placing herself between the rifles and Luna's family. "Emily wouldn't want this," she said quietly. "Your little girl wouldn't want you to hurt innocent families because you couldn't save hers." Marcus's rifle wavered for the first time. "You don't know anything about my daughter. I know she loved animals. I know she trusted you to protect the things she cared about, and I know that right now she's watching her daddy become the very monster she would have nightmares about." The clearing fell silent except for the sound of grown men breathing hard and the gentle rumbling of a mother bear who somehow understood that her fate hung in the balance of human conscience. Luna made her choice in that moment of perfect stillness. Instead of running or fighting, she walked slowly toward Marcus, her massive head low in submission, and did something that shattered every assumption about animal intelligence and emotion. She lay down at his feet and rolled onto her back, exposing her vulnerable throat in the ultimate gesture of trust and surrender. Luna's submission broke something fundamental in Marcus Blackwood's worldview. For 8 years, he had carried the narrative that bears were mindless killing machines. But the sight of this magnificent creature voluntarily exposing her throat, the most vulnerable gesture in the animal kingdom, shattered that carefully constructed hatred like glass against stone. "That's impossible," Marcus whispered, his rifle trembling in suddenly unsteady hands. Animals don't. They can't understand sacrifice. But Luna understood perfectly. Her amber eyes remained fixed on Marcus's face, not with the wild fear of a trapped animal, but with something that looked disturbingly like compassion. She had positioned herself so that any tranquilizer dart aimed at her would be impossible to redirect toward her cubs or the humans she had come to consider family. Margaret's nurse training recognized the signs of psychological collapse in Marcus's posture, the way his shoulders sagged, the confusion replacing determination in his eyes, the slight tremor that spoke of a man confronting truths he wasn't prepared to face. "She's protecting us," Margaret said softly, "just like Emily would have done for something she loved." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Emily had always been the protector, standing up to playground bullies, rescuing injured birds, using her own allowance to buy food for stray cats. The memory of his daughter's fierce compassion, deliberately buried under years of rage, came flooding back with devastating clarity. "Daddy, why do people hurt animals when they're just trying to live?" Emily had asked during their last camping trip, watching a documentary about poaching on her tablet. "When I grow up, I'm going to make sure nobody ever hurts them again." Marcus's hands began to shake so violently he could barely hold his rifle. "She's just an animal," he repeated desperately, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Just a stupid animal who doesn't know any better." Bobby, recognizing the moment when a man's soul hangs in the balance, stepped forward slowly. "Brother, I've been where you are. Lost my whole squad in a village outside Da Nang because I made one wrong call. Spent 40 years blaming everyone except the man in the mirror. You don't understand," Marcus's voice cracked. "I was supposed to protect her. That's what fathers do. They protect their little girls. I failed at the one job that mattered." Sarah, thinking of her own daughter Emma waiting for her return, felt her heart breaking for this man whose grief had transformed him into something he never meant to become. "Emily didn't die because you failed. She died because sometimes terrible things happen to beautiful people, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop it." Luna remained motionless in her position of surrender, but her cubs had begun to approach Marcus with the fearless curiosity of youth. The smaller cub, barely 8 months old, walked directly to Marcus's boots and began sniffing them with genuine interest, completely unaware that this man had come to destroy her family. The sight of the tiny cub investigating his boots while her mother lay helpless at his feet was more than Marcus could bear. The rifle slipped from his numb fingers, clattering onto the forest floor like the sound of chains breaking. "I can't," he whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I can't hurt something that reminds me of her. Emily would never forgive me." But Margaret's medical instincts, honed by decades of emergency situations, suddenly screamed danger. While they had been focused on Marcus's emotional breakdown, she had noticed subtle changes in her own body: dizziness, irregular heartbeat, a familiar tightness in her chest that she recognized with growing horror. "Something's wrong," she gasped, pressing her hand to her chest as pain radiated down her left arm. "I think I'm having—" Margaret collapsed before she could finish the sentence, her body hitting the forest floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the trees like a gunshot. Luna immediately abandoned her submissive position, rolling to her feet and rushing to Margaret's side with the urgency of a trained paramedic. "Heart attack," Bobby diagnosed, his military first aid training taking over as he dropped to Margaret's side. "Jimmy, check her pulse. Sarah, elevate her feet. We need to get her to a hospital now." But they were still hours from civilization, with no communication equipment and no way to call for help. Margaret's face had turned an alarming shade of gray, her breathing shallow and irregular. Luna hovered over her unconscious form, making distressed sounds that seemed to convey both grief and determination. Marcus stared at the scene before him. This elderly woman who had risked her life to save his soul, now dying in the middle of nowhere, tended by both humans and bears who clearly loved her. The irony was not lost on him that while he had been planning to steal Luna's family, Margaret's family was watching her slip away from them forever. "The emergency beacon," Marcus said suddenly, reaching into his pack. "I have satellite communication equipment. We can call for medical evacuation." In that moment, the poacher became the rescuer, and the hunted became the hunters of hope. The helicopter's rotors beat against the Amazon canopy like mechanical thunder, drowning out everything except the desperate prayers of people who had learned to love across species lines. Margaret lay unconscious on the forest floor, her breathing so shallow it barely moved her chest, while Luna maintained a vigil that defied every scientific understanding of animal behavior. "Minneapolis General Hospital, this is Amazon Rescue 7. The paramedic's voice crackled through Marcus's satellite radio. "We have a 68-year-old female, cardiac arrest, requesting immediate medical consultation." But as the medical team prepared for extraction, a truth began emerging that would transform everything they thought they understood about Margaret O'Sullivan's condition. The emergency room physician on the radio, Dr. Rebecca Chen, recognized Margaret's name immediately. "Did you say Margaret O'Sullivan?" Dr. Chen's voice carried a note of confusion through the static. "From Minneapolis, because according to our records, Mrs. O'Sullivan was diagnosed with advanced Alzheimer's disease 6 months ago. Her family was preparing to place her in memory care." The words hit Bobby like physical blows. Advanced Alzheimer's? But she's been sharp as a tack this whole time. Led our rescue, identified medicinal plants, performed first aid better than most paramedics. Jimmy's scientific mind raced through the implications. The only time Margaret showed any confusion was when Luna wasn't around. When she was caring for the bears, she was completely lucid. Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. She wasn't having memory problems. She was having family problems. The confusion, the forgotten medications. She was testing herself, proving she didn't belong in a nursing home. The revelation painted Margaret's Amazon adventure in an entirely different light. This hadn't been a farewell trip. It had been a desperate attempt to prove her worth to children who had already decided her fate. Every dollar of her life savings had gone into this expedition, choosing dignity over safety, purpose over comfort. She spent her pension on this trip instead of the assisted living deposit, Sarah realized, pieces falling into place. She came here to die free rather than live caged. Luna seemed to sense the gravity of Margaret's condition, her behavior becoming increasingly protective and desperate. She positioned her massive body as a windbreak against the helicopter's downdraft, shielding Margaret from debris while making soft, rumbling sounds that seemed intended to call her back to consciousness. But the most heartbreaking discovery came when Bobby reviewed the video footage he had captured throughout their ordeal. The camera revealed a pattern that none of them had noticed in real time. Margaret's cognitive abilities fluctuated dramatically based on her sense of purpose and connection. "Look at this," Bobby said, showing the others his phone screen. "Day 1, when we rescued Luna. Margaret is completely in charge, making medical decisions, leading the team. Day 3, when we were lost and she felt useless. That's when the confusion started." The footage revealed the truth about Alzheimer's that most families never understand. Purpose and love can sometimes push back the darkness, creating islands of clarity in an ocean of confusion. Margaret's brain, damaged by disease, had found strength in caring for others, particularly the bear family that needed her expertise. Marcus watched the medical preparations with growing anguish, recognizing in Margaret the kind of fierce independence his own daughter had possessed. "She reminds me of Emily," he admitted quietly. That same stubborn refusal to give up on anything she loved. The helicopter team faced an unprecedented dilemma. Their standard protocol required sedating any wild animals in the area before beginning medical evacuation, but Luna's behavior complicated everything. She refused to leave Margaret's side, and any attempt to force separation caused both the bear and the patient obvious distress. "I've never seen anything like this," the lead paramedic radioed back to base. "The bear is acting like family. Every time we try to move the patient, the animal becomes agitated and the woman's vital signs deteriorate." Dr. Chen's voice crackled through the radio with a decision that would make medical history. "If the bear's presence is stabilizing the patient, don't separate them. We'll adapt our protocols to accommodate the situation." The extraction became a delicate ballet of cooperation between species. Luna seemed to understand that the humans were trying to help Margaret, allowing the medical team to work while maintaining her protective position. The cubs, following their mother's lead, stayed close enough to provide comfort without interfering with emergency procedures. But as Margaret was prepared for transport, another truth emerged that would reshape their understanding of the entire Amazon adventure. In her medical kit, paramedics discovered a bottle of heart medication with doses dating back 3 months, medication that Margaret had been skipping, not forgetting. She knew, Jimmy whispered in realization. She knew her heart was failing. This whole trip wasn't about proving her mind was sharp. It was about doing something meaningful before she died. Sarah broke down completely, understanding finally hitting her. She didn't come here to prove she could live independently. She came here to prove she could die with dignity, doing something that mattered. The helicopter's arrival marked the beginning of separation that none of them were prepared for. Luna would have to stay in the Amazon while Margaret was transported to medical facilities thousands of miles away. The bond they had formed, this impossible friendship between an elderly nurse and a grateful bear, was about to be severed by the practical realities of human emergency medicine. As Margaret was loaded onto the stretcher, Luna made one final gesture that left everyone speechless. She approached the helicopter with obvious fear but undeniable determination, carrying something in her mouth. A small bouquet of the same medicinal leaves she had used to treat Margaret's wounds. "She's sending medicine," Bobby said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Luna's trying to send healing herbs with Margaret to the hospital." The paramedic, a 20-year veteran who thought he had seen everything, accepted the leaves with trembling hands. "I'll make sure the doctors know these came from her," he promised, though his voice was thick with tears. Marcus Blackwood faced his own moment of truth as the helicopter prepared for departure. His original mission had been to capture Luna and her cubs for profit, but watching the bear's devotion to Margaret had shown him something he thought he had lost forever: the capacity for love that transcends self-interest. "The emergency beacon," Marcus said suddenly, making a decision that would cost him everything and save what mattered most. "I'm activating the wildlife protection signal. Luna and her cubs are now under federal protection. Anyone who tries to harm them will answer to international law." The radio crackled with confusion from his own team members. "Boss, that's our payday you just threw away. Those bears are worth more than—" "They're worth more than money," Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying an authority born of moral clarity. "They're worth more than revenge. They're worth the kind of love my daughter believed in." As the helicopter lifted Margaret toward uncertain medical treatment, Luna's mournful calls echoed through the forest, a sound that would haunt everyone who heard it, a song of love that knew no boundaries between species, age, or the artificial divisions humans create to make sense of an incomprehensible world. 6 weeks after the Amazon rescue, Margaret O'Sullivan lay in the cardiac intensive care unit of Minneapolis General Hospital, surrounded by the steady beeping of machines that measured the rhythm of a heart that had learned to beat for others. The doctors called her recovery miraculous, not just surviving a massive heart attack in the middle of the rainforest, but maintaining cognitive function that defied every textbook understanding of Alzheimer's disease. But the real miracle was happening on her bedside table, where Bobby's battered smartphone played a continuous loop of Luna's recorded calls from the Amazon sanctuary where she now lived under federal protection. Every time the bear's distinctive rumbling vocalizations filled the room, Margaret's vital signs stabilized, her heart rate becoming strong and steady. "It's medically impossible," Dr. Rebecca Chen told Margaret's family during their daily conference. "According to every diagnostic test we've run, Mrs. O'Sullivan should be in advanced stages of dementia. Instead, her cognitive function has actually improved since the rescue." Margaret's son Michael and daughter Patricia sat in uncomfortable silence, finally confronting the truth they had been avoiding for months. Their mother's deteriorating condition had been largely fabricated, a desperate woman's attempt to avoid the nursing home they had already selected for her. "We failed her," Patricia whispered, tears streaming down her face as she watched her mother's peaceful expression while Luna's calls played. She was never losing her mind. She was losing her purpose. And we made it worse by treating her like a burden. The transformation in Margaret's children had been gradual but profound. Michael, a successful insurance executive who had spent years viewing his mother as a liability, now visited twice daily, bringing photo albums and asking about her nursing stories he had never bothered to hear before. Patricia, who had researched memory care facilities with the efficiency of a military operation, now researched animal therapy programs with the same dedication. "Mom always said healing comes from connection," Patricia told the medical team. "We just never understood that connection doesn't have to be human." The room had become an unofficial shrine to interspecies friendship, filled with flowers from well-wishers around the world who had seen Bobby's viral video of Luna protecting Margaret during the heart attack. The footage, viewed over 50 million times, had sparked a global conversation about animal intelligence, elderly care, and the healing power of purpose. But the most important visitor arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of a video call that would change everything. Jimmy Rodriguez, now famous for documenting the Margaret-Luna bond, had arranged a live connection between the hospital room and Luna's sanctuary in Peru through a partnership with the Cincinnati Zoo's advanced video technology. When Margaret's eyes opened to see Luna's face filling the large screen beside her bed, the medical monitors registered changes that made the nursing staff come running. Her heart rate jumped from 62 to 85 beats per minute, not from distress but from pure joy. "Patches," Margaret whispered, her voice stronger than it had been since the rescue. "My beautiful baby girl." Luna's reaction was equally dramatic. The massive bear approached the camera with obvious recognition, making the soft, rumbling sound she had used when comforting Margaret in the Amazon. Her cubs, now larger and more confident, crowded around their mother, seeming to remember the gentle human who had helped raise them during those crucial early months. "The neurological responses are unprecedented," Dr. Chen explained to the growing crowd of medical professionals who had gathered to witness the interaction. When Mrs. O'Sullivan engages with Luna, her brain activity patterns resemble those of a healthy person her age. The Alzheimer's symptoms essentially disappear. The video calls became daily events, each session monitored by researchers from 3 universities who were documenting what appeared to be the first recorded case of animal-assisted cognitive therapy reversing dementia symptoms. Margaret would spend hours teaching Luna's cubs through the screen, showing them hand signals she remembered from her zoo volunteer work, singing the Irish lullabies that had first calmed Luna as an injured cub. But the most remarkable development came when Margaret began experiencing what doctors termed lucid episodes, periods of crystal-clear memory and reasoning that lasted for hours after each video session with Luna. During these episodes, she would dictate detailed stories about her nursing career, create care plans for imaginary patients, and demonstrate the sharp medical judgment that had made her legendary among colleagues. "It's as if Luna's presence unlocks something in her brain," Dr. Chen reported to the International Medical Conference that had requested a presentation on the case. "The emotional connection seems to bypass the damaged neural pathways and activate dormant areas of cognitive function." The story reached its emotional crescendo when Margaret made a decision that would define the remainder of her life. During one of her lucid episodes, she called her family together for a conversation that would reshape their understanding of aging, dignity, and purpose. "I'm not going to any nursing home," Margaret announced with the authority of someone who had rediscovered her voice. "And I'm not going to pretend to be helpless when I'm not. Luna taught me that love doesn't diminish with age, it deepens, and I have too much left to give." The solution came from an unexpected source. Marcus Blackwood, the former poacher whose transformation had begun with Luna's act of trust, contacted Margaret's family with a proposal that seemed to come from divine intervention. Using the money he had saved from years of illegal hunting, Marcus wanted to establish the Emily Margaret Foundation, a facility that would combine elder care with animal therapy, allowing seniors to live with dignity while caring for rescued wildlife. "Emily would have loved the idea," Marcus explained during his visit to Margaret's hospital room. "And Mrs. O'Sullivan showed me that the best way to honor someone's memory is to protect the things they loved." The foundation would be built on land adjacent to Luna's sanctuary, allowing Margaret to maintain daily contact with the bear family that had saved her life. More importantly, it would serve seniors who, like Margaret, had been written off by families and medical systems that measured value by dependence rather than wisdom. Bobby McKenzie, whose amateur footage had started the global phenomenon, became the Foundation's first volunteer photographer, documenting the relationships between elderly residents and rescued animals. Sarah Williams, whose guide services had evolved into educational programs about human-animal bonds, became the facility's director of family services. Jimmy Rodriguez's research, funded by grants inspired by the Margaret Luna case, established the first academic center for studying therapeutic relationships between aging humans and rescued wildlife. His work would eventually lead to changes in how the medical community approached dementia treatment, proving that emotional connection could sometimes achieve what medicine alone could not. Margaret's release from the hospital became a media event, but more importantly, it became a family reunion. As her wheelchair was rolled toward the waiting ambulance that would transport her to the Foundation's new facility, she carried Luna's medicinal leaves, carefully preserved and framed, as a reminder that healing comes in forms science doesn't always understand. The final scene played out 6 months later, in the garden of the Emily Margaret Foundation, where Margaret sat in her favorite chair, watching Luna teach her now-adult cubs to forage in the adjacent sanctuary. The video call technology that had sustained their friendship during Margaret's recovery had given way to daily visits across the fence that separated their living spaces. "You know what the secret is, Patches?" Margaret said during one of their conversations, her voice carrying across the small distance between them. "Love doesn't have an expiration date. It just finds new ways to grow." Luna's responding rumble seemed to carry agreement, and perhaps something more. The acknowledgement that some bonds transcend species, age, and every limitation humans impose on the infinite capacity for connection that makes life worth living, regardless of how many years remain to be lived. In the end, Margaret O'Sullivan had found exactly what she came to the Amazon seeking. Not a dramatic death, but a meaningful life, surrounded by those who valued her not for what she could no longer do, but for the love she had never stopped giving. Margaret O'Sullivan's story isn't just about a woman and a bear. It's about every one of us who has ever felt invisible, forgotten, or pushed aside by a world that mistakes gray hair for diminished worth. At 68, Margaret faced what millions of American seniors confront daily. Children who see burden instead of wisdom, medical systems that treat symptoms instead of souls, and a society that warehouses experience instead of celebrating it. But in the Amazon rainforest, caring for a grateful mother bear, Margaret discovered something revolutionary: that our value doesn't decrease with age, it transforms. When Luna recognized her former caretaker after 3 years and risked everything to save Margaret's life, she proved what families often forget. Love remembers, even when memory fails. The most powerful moment wasn't Margaret's dramatic rescue, but her quiet decision to reject the nursing home and create a new life centered on purpose, not just survival. Margaret's cognitive abilities didn't improve because of medical intervention. They flourished because she rediscovered what made her feel alive. Her story challenges every assumption about aging in America and asks the question every senior faces: will you accept society's limitations, or will you write your own final chapters? Your wisdom isn't a burden, it's a gift waiting to be shared. What moment in your life made you feel most valuable and needed? Have you ever felt like your family sees you as a burden rather than a blessing? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters and could inspire someone who needs to hear it today.